Socialist Yugoslavia has a failed response to Mises and Hayek. So let's, he's got his PhD. Do you have your PhD now? So there we go. We have an educated person. You can trust him, obviously.
You always have to question everything, right? So don't trust me. So you have a hint why Socialist Yugoslavia, probably because I'm from there. So I'm putting together some personal experiences and reflections with some economic theory to explain some of the recent developments and developments in the last 50 or 60 years in this country. For any of you that don't know where this place used to be, Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, it was in southeastern Europe. Now it's 6 different countries. It's with a tendency of more than 6. So I start this little presentation with saying that in 1980 I too cried when our president, dictator Tito, died, but for different reasons. I was 1 year old, so I cried most of the time. But other people cried, most grown-up people cried at that point in time, and they expressed their fears in different ways. Most common one was that only he was able to keep the country afloat. So these people sensed something that some of the economists that were analyzing this country didn't. And what they sensed is that the level of well-being in the country was actually kept by him, and how it was kept is that he balanced between the East and the West, and basically he played sort of an American friend and was getting some financial help for being sort of a buffer zone towards the former Eastern Bloc, USSR. So I too grew up in the 80s in sort of a feeling that everything's fine, everything's great, but later we realized it was a credit bubble, and it was a bubble actually created not from within the country but from outside. The loans were coming from the International Monetary Fund, and when the time for paying the debts came, there wasn't anything to extract from this economy to pay debts back, and then accusations started. You know, Croatians stole our money, and you Serbs drained our budgets, and so that fueled a little bit old tensions there. Now, this makes it almost clear that things weren't working very well there. Now, it looks to us from this point now, but there were economists in the 70s and 80s who were claiming that this form of socialism is actually a solution. It was a response to Hayek and Mises that showed actually that there is a viable alternative to sort of free, laissez-faire capitalism. Mainly an alternative to private ownership of means of production. And that was it. Yugoslavia was the solution. So the Yugoslavia showed that Mises and Hayek were wrong. Now, what were Mises and Hayek saying? There were a few points that were important in the theory. One was that no single mind has all the necessary information that exists at different points in time within the economy that is available to different individuals to plan the economy in its totality. So individuals have that information of space and time, but now the problem is, how do they use that information effectively to manage resources? And Hayek's response or answer was, well, if they have freedom to act upon the information, then they can put resources into useful purposes. But the necessary element is that they know something about other people too. And where does this come from? From market prices. So market prices were this sort of minimum amount of information that you need in order to fit in together with everyone else. And you can't have market prices without exchange of ownership. And how can you have exchange of ownership if you don't have ownership, meaning private ownership? So that was their story. And in addition, when you have private ownership of means of production, individuals get both information and incentives to manage that those resources the best they can, to the benefit of themselves and everyone else. So that was the theory, and the story was, well, see, we can do it a different way. We can have common ownership of resources, and it still works. Well, it worked for a while, and people that lived there, actually, they didn't have to know a lot of economics. For example, my father wasn't an economist, but he kind of looked at the system and things, and he kind of thought, well, this is not going to last long. This, when you have, he would just say, everyone's no one's. When something is everyone's, it's no one's. And what it meant is that there was a common ownership of the means of production. So we had, say, factories. Now, workers employed at that factory would be said to own the factory. They have sort of the right to manage those resources in a way they agree is the best thing to do. And how they would do it is they would meet and they would vote on different decisions. Should we do this? Should we do that? Should we produce more or less? Should this person become the manager, or should that person become the manager? So those were the sort of decisions that were being made. But one crucial point is that these workers, they had the right to manage the resource, but they didn't actually own it. So, for example, if you leave the factory you work for, you don't have a right to claim any share in the capital resources of that factory. So in a sense, your incentives to manage the capital base for the factory weren't very high. You would rather vote for increases in wages, so you can take that wage home and buy some producer goods, there were markets for producer goods and they were privately owned, consumer goods, sorry. So you would buy, say, a car, you would buy a new house, you would renovate your house, all these things that you can keep for yourself. So you had sort of division of ownership where you could own a house, you could own a small plot of land, or you could have, say, 10 acres of land for agriculture. So you could buy farm machinery, you could get a loan that would be financed through your factory. So all these things, you have incentives to sort of extract as much as you can from this common pool, common ownership resource into your own. So you can manage your own house and you can manage your own farm the way you want to. So we had here what we could call misallocation of resources, or changes in the structure of production that was slowly becoming unsustainable because you are draining the capital base for the factories. That's one thing. The other element of Hayek's story is that you need private ownership of not only consumer goods but producer goods as well, capital goods, so that you get these time and place specific elements of information built into the prices of capital goods. In the case of former Yugoslavia, capital goods you could sell to another sort of worker-managed factory under the price that the government sets and under the conditions that the government sets. You couldn't sell it to an independent individual. So we didn't have sort of price mechanism working there. So that's two problems. Now how things were run in the factories as well is they used, of course, labor theory of value. There was no subjective theory of value. So there was a sort of a scale for different kinds of labor and sort of different number of points. So if you do this, you have this many points, and this is your wage rate. If you do this is your number of points, and that's your wage rate. So it doesn't really matter how much people want the services that you provide, if you do something that we think is valuable, it's paid more, right? So the incentives were just to get to the number of points that you want, regardless of whether you have the skills needed there or not. Because in the end, as long as you satisfy the people that are sort of above you in this political structure, you're fine. So in this case, it's not the economic entrepreneurship that were allowing you to advance, but political. How do you satisfy people that are already in power within your worker-managed factory? And the whole decision-making process was sort of in a politically structured manner where you vote on different things. And here I have stories from my dad. He said one year he decided to become the member of the Communist Party because that's the only way you could advance, right? You can't advance if you're not a member. So that's the precondition, right? You have to be politically suitable. There was a term for that. And so he said, I'm going to do that for 1 year to see how things work. And that's how things worked. He said, it doesn't really matter how smart you are when you give some sort of a speech at this assembly. As long as you can impress the most people, and oftentimes impressing most people didn't really correlate much with sound arguments, that's the key. And you always have to vote. You have to go through the motions. So that's how things worked within these factories. The other example was the example of lack of incentives to care for this common property was that people would collude. For example, you had a guard at the factory entrance. You would collude with him and with your manager, whoever you needed to, and you'll take something out, right? And maybe someone knows, but people who are important are keeping quiet, and that's fine. So all these perverse incentives were leading to degrading the financial viability of these factories. The other thing was that competition was sort of very limited, because you would have to organize a new factory, and to organize that you needed political connections. So generally it's not about your entrepreneurial ability that was deciding whether you're going to start a new business or not, but your political connections, or whether you're going to start or whether you're not going to start. And generally the existing factories grew a lot, so they resembled more monopolies than anything. So competition was very limited there. So what was happening in the 80s, and I remember that we had in the popular culture, it's sort of funny, there was like sitcoms where you have a family and everybody's employed at some place in a publicly owned factory, and everything's failing, right? And that's sort of a source of comedy. I guess we had to laugh at that, but that was reality. The bills were coming home to pay for rent, to pay for electricity, but your boss hasn't paid you for 3 months, and that was like a common story in the 80s for comedies, but it was reality. So to keep these factories afloat, the government was sort of flipping, using some funds from the budget from more successful companies into less successful companies, printing some more money to fund them, getting some more loans from outside to keep this. There was no failing. Nobody's failing. There's no failing companies there. Everything's always staying functioning. And eventually, in the late 80s, around 1990, we had almost double-digit inflation, and after 1990, it went even worse, and that sort of triggered all sorts of events after that. And so we had an empirical case of an economy falling apart and sort of a proof that it wasn't actually a response to Mises and Hayek. It was a confirmation of their fears and doubts about doing things this way. And so, I guess if you like numbers, this is a chart from a study that was done in early 80s, and basically all these numbers are different indicators of productivity growth. Yeah, you have minuses, so if you have growth in the minus, that's not really growth. That would be a decline. So you get minuses pretty much in 3/4 of the chart. So, numbers, aggregate numbers always have their faults, but still as indicators of productivity, you can see that even in the late 60s and during the 70s, things weren't working that well. But the amount of foreign loans were sufficient to keep the illusion until the 90s. Thank you.
My question is, do you have a hard time convincing Canadians of this story? Because I have a hard time.
I have to talk to them individually, and then it takes a few hours, but I have to focus on issue one by one, but I understand what you're saying. Because they have a structure of thinking which you have to analyze little by little to show. Yes?
This whole issue with the IMF has been repeated over and
Yes.
over. It's not just in your country. It's
Yeah.
It's kind of a disease spreading around the whole planet.
Yeah.
Where they give the money away when it comes to collect. They basically say, well, you don't have the money, so you've got to give us something for it, right?
Yes, yes.
And usually that's where all the discontent comes from, right?
Yes. So it's just a matter, and this is half speculation, is a matter of how needed the stability is at that point in time. We know what happened in 1989 in Germany, and with the Soviet Union right after that. So a buffer zone to Soviet Union wasn't really needed after 1990. So keeping this place alive wasn't really a priority.
It's really amazing to see, like, when a country like yours, it goes from complete dictatorship to a little bit more free market principles. I'm wondering here, like, did everybody really start to think that they were going to be free and like everybody else? And like, I imagine there's like this really exciting period where you start to be able to reap some of your own benefit, and like it's really, you know what I mean? And I think like China went through that process too, and then in the long run, it's just like, it doesn't really work in the long run.
Yeah.
So is it almost like, does it almost feel like you had the carpet swept from under your feet, and being promised that you guys are going to be so much more productive than you actually were?
Well, I guess with China it's a little bit different because they didn't really fall apart completely. In our case, there was lots of reforms every 5 or whatever, 10 years. We're going to fix, people were seeing problems, but the fixes were just cosmetic, right? And it's sad, but until everything fell apart completely, people didn't really feel like changing things. And then when it fell apart...
I was going to say, in Serbia, you still can't open a bank account from any financial institution outside Serbia.
PayPal doesn't work in Serbia. I'm working with some...
But it's illegal to have a PayPal account in Serbia. Bitcoin.
So yeah,
you're not allowed to open up an account with any financial institution of any kind.
They're still in recovery.
No, but that's the thing. It's like with the United States. I mean, the housing market falls apart, and people still complain. They had the 99ers in the United States, where people were on 99 weeks of unemployment, and all that does, it keeps them locked in place. I'm gonna get a job where I'm living. I can hold on to my house, and it's just not gonna happen, right? And it's just you're prolonging the pain.
Yeah. So I hope it's not the only way to change things, you know, to hit the bottom. But in this case, it was.
Yeah, totally. So, any other questions or?
I have a general question for like the whole meetup. Is your goal for this to like start expanding these messages, or just to like, kind of get communities together and talk about them?
Oh no, we just want an echo chamber.
Just tell us how great we are.
Yeah.
What happens at Mises meetup stays at Mises.
Oh no, for sure. Yeah, no, definitely. The Mises, I don't know if you know about it, but yeah. So we're incorporated in Canada. We're a registered charity. So if people donate money, they get a tax receipt. So we're actively out there putting out proposals to bring in funds. And then yeah, we've run 2 conferences, one in Calgary, one in Toronto. We're running meetups in Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver right now, 3 cities. Yeah, so it's just a question of growing, right? It's a slow thing. Right now, I'm basically the only employee of Mises Institute of Canada. I've got a bunch of volunteers, and I'll tell you, I don't pay myself anything right now. Maybe I pay for my cell phone, but that's about it. But yeah, no, like we've done pretty well. We've raised some money. Things are going well. More and more people are coming out to these events, and like you guys, I've never heard of you guys before, and you just showed up. And,
I don't even know. I honestly don't even remember how I found your website. I just copied and pasted the link.
Yeah,
And like stories like this, like I feel like it should be on TV, and like people should we should start telling Canadians like if you can.
I agree.
This is what's going to happen. Here are like examples of it happening.
well, this is going to be on Vimeo. Well, this is the thing, right? But this is the. I mean, I just did an interview with Jeff Tucker yesterday. We talked for about an hour long, and we're gonna put it online. And this is the whole thing that. I mean, now with the internet, we have the ability to really go back and look at what happened. In previous days, you know, the next generation would get to school, they'd read the textbooks that had the filtered version of history that whoever was writing these textbooks wanted to produce and show. And this is the thing, for Samuelson wrote a textbook for how many years? 50 years he wrote a textbook? 20 editions talking about basically, hey, the Soviet Union is great, you can really, and this is what everybody in Economics 101 would read, that, centralized state planning of the economy can work, and it works really well. Just look at the Soviet Union. Their GDP is, out of this world, right?
Yeah, Krugman. I was taught by Krugman. So.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, no, his textbook. He's got to be quiet. The thing is that, 10, 15 years ago, that's all you got. And then you got into the working world, you got a job, you would work. But now it's, the fact is now that Predrag's talk, his whole talk is going to be on Vimeo tomorrow or the next day, and you can now send it to all your friends. Right? That's for sure. We're looking to grow the organization. It's a national organization, and if you want to volunteer, take my number at the end of this meeting. I'll be very happy to. And one day maybe I'll pay you. Anyway, so do you want Chris Orlacher? I think he's going to speak now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.